Welcome back to the Piping Pastor. Well, today we're getting back into poetry in the Bible, also answering to one of the questions, or not questions, one of the topics that was brought up by Brother Doug, Trucking Piper, in one of his videos. I mentioned he had done one where he talked about the Trinity, and another one where he had talked about the blood of Jesus. And so we're going to be talking about the blood of Jesus a little bit today. For that, I'm smoking today in my Peterson Lestrade, and in it, I'm smoking a mystery blend. This blend is unknown to me. Not because like I ordered a mystery blend like the secret blend from Country Squire or something. No, this is literally a blend. I am just not sure what I have. So in my little tobacco cabinet here, and I have not done a tobacco cabinet tour in a couple of years. I think I'll take a little tour on that. I'll show you kind of like my perspective, like what I see when I'm recording these videos, and like the small section of my library. This is just my library of poetry, and then where my tobaccos look and what that looks like. I'll show that here. So, as promised, here's my little tour. The top shelf of my barrister bookshelf, and I have no decorative pipes. All the pipes that I have I actually use. So that's my little Scottish pipe, and then of course my massive meerschaum, which I don't smoke often, but I do still smoke. And then my books of poetry here in the barrister bookshelf, and then over here the other pipes. That little cup there is one I made with my daughter at a pottery workshop, a daddy-daughter day we were having. And then that rose in there is actually a silk rose that one of my other daughters gave me because she thought it was sad that boys never got flowers until they died. So she wanted to make sure I received some kind of flowers before my funeral, and got flowers there. But this is an old antique, what they call a pie shelf or pie something, pie safe. That's what it is. And it's handmade. It's all wooden. All the wood, everything in here is all wooden. There's no metal screw to be found. It's all dowel rods and things of that nature. But in it, I have also, more of my poetry books. But here is where we get to my tobaccos. So let me set my pipe down here for a second so I can use both hands. But here's how I label them. So I have these little labels that I make on the top of each one. I use the ball canning jars, as most of you do, and then I make these little labels with what I call hillbilly lamination. So that's clear tape on the top and it's duct tape on the bottom. And there's my haunted pirate ship, which I jarred up a few weeks ago, about another month or so of aging, and I'll start cracking into that one. Here's my rub out tray. Actually, this is how I rub out my tobaccos. Rather than use the typical leather like square thing, I found this guy here at a charity shop several years ago, and works great for rubbing out the amount of tobacco that I need to have. And then because this shape comes to a nice little point, once I get the tobacco down to the little fine bits, I can just tip this guy up actually into the mouth of my pipe, and it goes directly in there, and it puts the kindling on top of the pipe. So some more of my jarred tobacco over here. And then down here I have my cutting for, this is for cutting plug tobacco. And the little tray there that I cut the plug into and then rub out in that one. And then down here I have, of course, some more jars and more books of poetry. And then the bottom shelf, there's some Fayum, and the jar that the Fayum will go into as soon as I get that one opened up here shortly. Some of the larger jars I have here are the old Dark Fired, and then the Northwoods down here. And then my tins, my backup tins of my favorite tobacco, which is the Bourbon Barrel Aged Plum Pudding over here. And then some of the Fusiliers Ration, which I dug into, or I purchased in a couple months ago when I was afraid that this would go away. I don't think it's going to, but a couple cigars here in my little Tupperware, my homemade Tupperware, with a couple extra linings and some humidor packs in there. And then my big tub of Carter Hall, because I don't smoke Carter Hall too terribly often. It's not one of my go-to main everyday tobaccos, and that is a large amount of tobacco. I had the option of either keeping in this and risking drying it out, or buying a couple more of these and putting it in there. So this was my experiment. I got some and put in a little ball jar here, so I can smoke a couple ounces at a time. And then I sealed it back up in here and wrapped it like 4 times in saran wrap. to try to keep the seal tight and full. So I'm going to give this about a month and then pop it open and see if that worked. If not, I'll rehydrate it and then put it in one of these. But I thought I would just give that a pop, give that a try. So in any case, there is the great tour. Oh, I forgot to mention this, my little match holder. This is a marble pipe that one of my other daughters on a trip to Mexico found this and brought it back. And it is drilled actually down through here, but this part is just glued. So I'm pretty positive smoking in this would have been a horrible idea. I found this little glass bottom tray here, glued it to this glass tray, added a match strike strip there, and then I just use it to hold my matches there. So I get to keep it even as a nice little keepsake. So in any case, there's that tour. So back to the regular video. So you can see, I do the ball canning jars for all of my tobaccos that are not in tins. And for this particular jar is unlabeled because when I got in my Carter Hall and some of the other tobaccos, I was like, I need to make some space for them. And I had a few partial jars of some other tobaccos. And I know Railroad by Boswell was one of them. Maltese Falcon was one of them. I think there was something else. I can't remember. That's the thing. I can't remember. But there were 2 or 3 that were just partial jars of stuff that was okay, that I liked, but I knew I was not going to order again. Stuff that I thought was, passable tobacco, but nothing that really rang my bell. And so I was like, you know what? I'm just going to chuck all these together and make like a little, just house blend of stuff. And because of that, I didn't have a label for it. I showed you the labels actually that are on the jars, but I have like a whole stack of labels here in my little drawer if I can reach them of tobaccos I've ordered in the past or ones that I like. I make these little labels for the top of the jars. But because it was just a mixture of stuff, I didn't have a label for it. And I thought, I'm going to remember. I'll remember what's in there. Well, age is the thing. So I do not remember what was in there. I think Maltese Falcon and Railroad Yard were in there, but I'm not entirely sure. So I opened the jar up today and I dumped it out in my little rubbing tray, which I showed you in there. And I cannot remember. It looks like there is some Latakia in there and some Bright Virginias. There's no Stowe Virginias. It didn't look like there was any Dark Fire. Looks like there's some Perique, but not entirely sure. I don't think there's any Orientals. I could not tell from the jar note anything that really jumped out at me. So I packed a pipe and I've been smoking it. And it's really rather nice. But it tastes kind of like a nondescript English, essentially. So a bit like Maltese Falcon, like it's there, but it's not really anything woohoo, maybe it's a bit more flavorful than Maltese Falcon. So I'm venturing to say it's Maltese Falcon and at least 2 or 3 other things. So, but one way or another, it's not bad. So I'm just gonna smoke it to get to the jar. So we'll get through that and we'll move on to the next thing. But I am happy to say I do have a bit more tobacco coming in here in a couple of weeks. Just one. The Sleepy Hollow from Strauss Tobacconist. I have never had it before. I've never been a real big aromatic person, so it's never been a thing of mine to have a bunch of, flavored tobaccos and so forth. And I also don't typically chase the limited edition blends when stuff comes out for a limited amount of time or a limited production run. That's just not my thing. I prefer to order tobaccos I like that I know I can always get a hold of, or at least get enough to hold a few in my cellar. But this Sleepy Hollow, first time I heard about it was on Mutton Chop's channel years and years ago. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. But at the time, I was living in Scotland, and the deeming regulations had just changed here in the United States. So people were leery about shipping tobaccos back and forth. And in point of fact, I had no real interest in going through the rigmarole of trying to get tobacco from the United States and paying the extra tariffs and everything else that went along with that. And I was happy with the tobacconist I had on the Royal Mile. He did his own blends. He had one blend that I pretty much loved, and that's the blend that I smoked. I had one pipe, one tobacco, and I was a happy camper. So when I got back to the States and I started expanding and, thinking about, trying different stuff, what was it, 5, 6 years ago? I was like, you know what, I'm gonna give that a go one of these times. And every year over the last 5 years, I would think as fall started, getting into season, it's like, oh yeah, I got to get some of that Sleepy Hollow, and then I would forget about it until I would see someone smoking it on the YTPC, and then be reminded of it, like, oh yeah, and then I'd try to order it. By then they're out. So this year, I was on my computer doing my thing, checking my email, and I got an email notice from the Country Squire about some Halloween blend that they were doing. I can't remember, witches something or other. I can't remember the name right now. But it reminded me, oh yeah, you wanted to try that Sleepy Hollow for like the last 4 years. And so I gave them a call and they were out. But they do have some more coming in. So I pre-ordered some and they said probably a week to 10 days they'll get it in, ship it out to me. So hopefully in a couple weeks I'll be having some Sleepy Hollow to smoke. And I dearly hope it's good because right now it's been 5 years in the making. All right. In any case, on to the content for today. So I mentioned I would not do this just as a straight VR, get back into the poetry and the Bible series. So we're going to be looking at a poem by Thomas Hardy. But prior to that, Blood of Christ. The question generally is that one of, is it literal or is it symbolic? Because we have, discussions of it in the New Testament. We have, of course, all those old school hymns, washed in the blood of the Lamb, every blood washed sinner, and so forth. And we know we're not literally washed in blood, right? Christ did not produce trillions of gallons of blood for every Christian to take a literal shower in, even though that's the imagery we get from a lot of those hymns and so on and so forth. So the question becomes, well, is it just a symbolic representation then? But then we also have the discussion between Protestants and Catholics about communion and the transubstantiation and, the transformation of the wine into blood and so on and so forth. So then it goes back to, well, is it literal then? Again, are we talking about something literal? And the answer is yes. It's literal and symbolic. So I hesitate to use the term symbolic because that makes it sound as if it's just some kind of mere representation. I would prefer to use the term literal and spiritual because they're talking about the literal blood of Christ and the spiritual action of that blood. Because we have, from the earliest scriptures in the Old Testament, representations of the blood of animals, of sacrificed animals, atoning for the sins of the Israelites. And well, you can go all the way back to Genesis, the sacrifice of the animals and covering of the skins on Adam and Eve, if you're talking about sin. But that gets into original sin and Genesis 1 and 2, and that's an entirely different discussion, which I think I've already done videos on. In any case, so we have this representation, right? And annually, the Israelites would come to Jerusalem, to the temple, offer the lamb for their sacrifice. And there were different animals sacrificed for different things, for different reasons. And you can go through Leviticus and read about that. But generally speaking, to atone for the sins of the family for the whole past year, the lamb would be offered as a sacrifice on the altar. The blood sprinkled on the altar to atone for the sacrifice of the sins of the family in the previous year. And you can see representations of that in Job actually as well. Job did that for his children. He assumed they had sinned the previous night in their parties. He would sacrifice an animal. And that's not meant to be some kind of like blood sacrifice like to an ancient Near East god, little g god, like Molech or Dagon or Baal or Cherith and so on and so forth. We're not talking about that kind of thing where they have to feed the god with the blood, because God, our God, the God, true God, does not require blood to like drink and survive as those other ancient Near East representations did. This is to demonstrate that, when you mess up, you have to atone for it. There has to be that kind of substitutionary atonement when you separate yourself from God with sin. So Christ was the perfect sacrifice because Christ, A, was sinless, but Christ was also God. So what we have with the blood of Christ is a sacrifice in a truly sovereign sense, in a way that only a true sovereign can make, and that is for all people for all time. So one action from God to cover everyone who ever existed, everyone who exists, and everyone who will exist for all eternity. It's one action for everybody, for everywhere, a truly sovereign act. And so Christ, because Christ was a human being, Christ was all God and all human, there was literal blood. There was a literal blood sacrifice. And that's the doctrine of substitutionary atonement for sin, of course, that we have traditionally throughout the entire tradition, from the earliest scriptures through the New Testament. But we also have the spiritual sense of that covering of Christ's blood. Because, as I said, Christ did not produce trillions of gallons of blood. We don't get a gallon of blood, from Christ in a physical, literal sense to dump on ourselves when we become Christians. But that action, that one sovereign act of the spilling of blood of Christ covers us in that same sense, as if it was literal, as if it was literally done for us, because the sprinkling of Christ's blood, in the same way that the sprinkling of the lamb's blood for the Jewish people once a year at Jerusalem covers us. Because the family did not go in and sacrifice the lamb and sprinkle the blood on themselves. They couldn't go in there. They couldn't go into the Holy of Holies. That was the priest's job. So the sacrifice was made by the priest at the altar for the family, and that sprinkling of the blood is what covered their sins, in the same way that Christ's literal blood and the literal spilling of Christ's blood covers us. But because Christ is singular, because Christ is God, that blood does more than just 1 year for one family. That does everybody in the family of Christ, those who have confessed Christ as Lord, for all eternity. That's special. So, the poem we have for that today is Unkept Good Fridays by Thomas Hardy. There are many more Good Fridays than this, but if we knew the names and could relate them, of men whose rulers slew for their goodwill, and date them as runs the 12th month through. These nameless Christ's Good Fridays, whose virtues wrought their end, bore days of bonds and burning, with no man to their friend, of mockeries and spurning, yet they were all unpenned. When they had their Good Fridays of bloody sweat and strain, oblivion hides. We quote not their dying words of pain, the sepulchres we note not, unwitting where they've lain. No annual Good Fridays gain them from cross and cord, from being sawn asunder, disfigured and abhorred, smitten and trampled under. Such dates no hands have scored. Let be, let lack Good Fridays, these Christ unwrit names. The world was not even worthy to taunt their hopes and aims, as little of the earth earthy as his mankind proclaims. So Hardy wrote this to say, okay, we have this Good Friday for Jesus, but we have tons of other people who have died righteously, who have died, who were murdered by rulers for this reason or that, and they were noble people, but we don't remember them, but we don't celebrate their Fridays. And in this one, he's kind of punching at Christianity a little bit and saying, well, what about all these other people, right? We don't remember them. History doesn't remember them. And that's correct. And these people may have been, great people. They may have been very worthy, and they may have been sacrificed, or murdered by unjust rulers, and all these unfair circumstances, and so on and so forth. And as great as they may have been, as worthy as they may have been or been remembered, they're not. And they're not because their death was not singular. They were just humans. We still remember the work of Christ on the cross, because it's not just a matter of history. It's not just a matter of some really cool dude, or some really righteous guy, or some really great teacher, or some really moral or ethical person who was put to death unjustly by an unjust ruler. That's not what this is. If that were the case, it would be probably not recorded in the annals of history. The reason we know it, the reason we still remember it, the reason we still celebrate it, is because Christ's blood covers us in a spiritual sense. That literal shedding of blood has a spiritual effect on us. So even 2,000 years later, and way, way far into the future we haven't even gotten to yet, it will still have a dramatic effect on humanity. and will continue to have a dramatic effect on humanity throughout all of history. We remember it because it's part of who we are. We remember it, we know it, we feel it, we see the effects of it because it was singular and special, literally and spiritually. So, hopefully, that sheds a bit more light on the question that Brother Doug brought up. And once again, revelation of God is an awesome thing, and it's a great thing to discuss and chat about. So, I'm going to turn back to my mystery tobacco, and maybe I'll come up with a name for it because I've got like 2 ounces, so it's going to take me a while to get through it. If I do, I'll let you know. But I hope you have a lovely week. As always, happy reading.